So, read along with me. If you've got your Bibles in front of you, great. If not, it's on the screen. One Sabbath, he was going through the grain fields, that he being Jesus. And as they, Jesus and his disciples, made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are they doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" And he said to them, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest, and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests to eat, and also gave it to those who were with him. And he said to them, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." Again, he entered the synagogue, and a man was there with a withered hand. And as they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. And he said to the man with the withered hand, "Come here." And he said to them, "Is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm, to save life or to kill?" But they were silent. And he looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart, and said to the man, "Stretch out your hand." He stretched it out, and his hand was restored. The Pharisees went out and immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. So as you can see, this passage this morning is all about the Sabbath. More specifically, what is lawful to do on the Sabbath. The Sabbath was the seventh day of the week, and it was a day on which the Jews didn't do any work. It was a day of rest. With this in mind, to really grasp the importance of this passage, we need to first understand the significance of the Sabbath to the Israelites, to the Jews, and specifically the Pharisees. And the best way to do that, what's the best way to understand anything? Is go all the way back to the beginning. So, we're not going to quite go back to the beginning yet. We're going to go to Exodus 20, starting at verse 8. It's going to be on the screen, so don't worry, you don't have to flick there in your Bibles, but you can do if you want to. This is where God is giving the law to Moses on Mount Sinai. And specifically in Exodus chapter 20, God is giving Moses the 10 commandments. One of those commandments is this: remember the Sabbath day and keep it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work. But the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, you or your son or your daughter, your male servant or your female servant, or your livestock, or the sojourner who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea, and all that is in them, and rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy. Let's look at this law a bit more closely. It tells the Israelites that they should do all their work on 6 days, and then on the seventh day they are to rest from all their work. Crucially, they are to do this because of the example God gave in the creation of the world. If we go even further back, all the way to Genesis chapter 2, we see this, the idea where the Sabbath originated. Thus the heavens... There we go, thanks, Dan. Thus the heavens and the earth were finished, and all the host of them. And on the seventh day, God finished his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work that he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and made it holy, because on it, God rested from all his work that he had done in creation. If you don't get the idea, God rested from the work that he'd done on the seventh day in creation. It only says it about a bajillion times in those 3 verses. So the idea of the Sabbath was originated all the way back in creation, and then in Exodus, when God is giving the law, he's cementing it in. And it's clear that this law was important. It gets repeated at least twice more in Exodus. Exodus 31:14-15. You shall keep the Sabbath. because it is holy for you. Everyone who profanes it shall be put to death. Whoever does any work on it, that soul shall be cut off from among his people. 6 days shall work be done, but the seventh day is a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath shall be put to death. And then again, in Exodus 35, 1-3, Moses assembled all the congregation of the people of Israel and said to them, "These are the things that the Lord has commanded you to do. 6 days' work shall be done, but on the seventh day you shall have a Sabbath of solemn rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on it shall be put to death. You shall kindle no fire in your dwelling places on the Sabbath day." But both of these have a similar emphasis to the one given in the Ten Commandments. The only thing that they add is whoever does any work on it, that being the Sabbath, shall be put to death. And that just shows how seriously they are to take this law. So the Sabbath was really important to the Israelites, particularly the Pharisees. The Sabbath was a crucial way that the Israelites were set apart from other people. Therefore, it was precious to them, and they wanted to make sure that they did it right. But what is there really to get wrong? The law seems fairly easy to understand. On the seventh day, you're to stop all your work and have a day of rest, because that day is holy. That's it. Actually sounds quite freeing, really. The Sabbath was created as a gift to Israel from God. It was supposed to be a day of rest for you, for your family, for your servants, your animals, and your land. It was the one day a week where you don't do any work. It was a gift. Unfortunately, the Jewish religious system created by the religious leaders, like the Pharisees, believed that the way to God was through the strict following of the law. And well, if that's the case, you better understand what it's saying, and you better understand how to follow it. So this resulted in the Pharisees creating a huge number of extra laws and rules as they sought to define what work was. Because if you're going to rest on the seventh day from all your work, you need to make sure that you're not working on the seventh day when you're supposed to be resting. In fact, in the Talmud, which is the primary source of Jewish religious law, there are 24 chapters of Sabbath laws. These rules the Pharisees enforced around the Sabbath included things like, on the Sabbath, you could only walk 1,999 steps. As soon as you walked your 2,000th step, you've broken the Sabbath law. You've worked. You can only carry something as long as it weighed no more than a dried fig. I was going to try and find a dried fig. I couldn't find one. Or a fig roll to demonstrate. But I didn't. But you can imagine, it's not that heavy. You could only carry something as long as it weighed no more than a dried fig. If you throw something in the air and catch it in your other hand, you've broken the Sabbath. But if you throw it in the air and catch it in the same hand, you're fine. I don't know how that one works. You couldn't light a candle if it was unlit, but if you already had a lit candle, you couldn't put it out. In my research, I saw some slightly different versions of this one. It's a bit of a debate, but you could write between 1 and 2 letters. And just to clarify, that's not like, "Dear Sir / Madam, I hope you're well." You could write 1 or 2 letters of the alphabet. So you could write "her" or "hi," but that was it. If you found a hole in your clothes, you were permitted to sew 1 stitch. Women, you couldn't wear jewelry because it weighed more than a fig, unfortunately. And this goes on and on and on for 24 chapters of the Talmud. Our passage this morning specifically is concerned with harvesting on the Sabbath. You weren't allowed to harvest on the Sabbath, but it just goes on and on and on. Apparently, one rabbi spent 2.5 years studying one chapter of the Sabbath rules to understand all the details of it. As you can hopefully see, this system was oppressive. It was unbiblical, and it was brutally unkind. The Sabbath was a gift from God to Israel, but the Pharisees with their teachings had made an oppressive system that burdened people under its weight. And the Pharisees brandished these rules over people's heads. You've carried more than a dried fig, you've broken the Sabbath. In our passages this morning, you're picking the heads of corn, or the heads of grain. You're harvesting. You've broken the Sabbath. This is legalism. This is what happens when you believe that the way to God is through following rules. So turning back to Mark chapter 2, verse 23, armed with this context, let's see how Jesus responds. Look with me at verse 23. One Sabbath, he, that being Jesus, was going through the grain fields, and as they, Jesus and his disciples, made their way, his disciples began to pluck heads of grain. And the Pharisees were saying to him, "Look, why are you doing what is not lawful on the Sabbath?" Okay, so according to the Pharisees, Jesus' disciples were doing something unlawful on the Sabbath. That unlawful thing was plucking the heads of grain. By the way, they weren't stealing. The Jewish law allowed for this to happen. Their issue was that they were doing it on the Sabbath, and they said that that was work and therefore unlawful. Then Jesus responds, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry? He and those who were with him, how he entered the house of God in the time of Abiathar the high priest and ate the bread of the presence, which is not lawful for any but the priests eat, and also gave it to those who were with him." Jesus takes the Pharisees back to their shared source of authority, God's word. Jesus takes them to a story in 1 Samuel chapter 21. Feel free to read that in your own time. Unfortunately, we don't have time to read it now. But I'll do a quick summary. Crucially, this is a story including David, who the Pharisees would have had huge respect for. And it's David breaking God's law. So what's going on? David's running for his life from King Saul. That's the context of this story. And he comes to the priest and asks if they have any food. The priest says that the only food he has is the bread of the presence. This is the bread that was placed before God in the tabernacle, which was the center of worship at the time. The law states that every week it was 12 loaves of bread, and those 12 loaves would be placed before God, and then at the end of the week they'd be replaced by fresh loaves, and those loaves that they've taken from before God was only to be allowed to be eaten by the priests. Therefore, David eating the loaves is directly against God's law. So why is Jesus bringing this up? Well, the point Jesus is making is that in times of need, ritual can be done away with. The text literally says, "Have you never read what David did when he was in need and was hungry?" David is running for his life and he's hungry. The compassionate thing to do is to provide food. It's the right thing to do. It's the good thing to do. But the Pharisees have created a system where you can't do that. Their rules didn't allow for any compassion, and we'll see that in chapter 3. So, then Jesus says how the Pharisees have twisted the Sabbath with his phrase in verse 27. And I actually think that the NLT version of this phrase, how the NLT translates it, is really helpful here. It says, can I have that slide up, Dan, please? Thank you. The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made to meet the needs of people and not people to meet the requirements of the Sabbath. In other words, the Sabbath was a gift from God, and they have made it into an oppressive system that hangs over people's heads. Then in verse 28, Jesus says, "So the Son of Man is Lord even of the Sabbath." The Son of Man is a title that Jesus refers to himself frequently, or uses to refer to himself frequently throughout Mark's Gospel. So Jesus is calling himself Lord of the Sabbath. But what does this mean? Jesus is calling himself God. Because who else is Lord of the Sabbath if not the person who created the Sabbath and set it into Israel's law? Therefore, Jesus is saying that he is God. He created the Sabbath. He is Lord of the Sabbath. He defines the rules of the Sabbath. He defines what is lawful to do on the Sabbath, not the Pharisees. The tension rises as you go into chapter 3. It's a new Sabbath. Jesus is in the synagogue, and there is a man with a withered hand, and the Pharisees are also there. Look at what verse 2 says about the Pharisees. It says, they watched Jesus to see whether he would heal him, that's the man with the withered hand, on the Sabbath, so that they might accuse him. The Pharisees are watching Jesus closely, wanting him to break the Sabbath. Why? So that they can accuse him. So let's imagine the scene. Jesus is teaching. The Pharisees are in the room watching his every move, specifically trying to see if Jesus will heal this man with a withered hand on the Sabbath. And Jesus knows exactly what they're doing and pulls up the man with the withered hand. A withered hand is it's like a paralyzed hand. It's a hand that doesn't work. And this man would likely have not been able to work because of his hand, and therefore his livelihood would not be great. Perhaps he's begging. We don't fully know, but regardless, he is clearly a man in need. So Jesus brings this guy up, puts him in front of everyone who's there, and then turns to the spiritual elite, the ones who are supposed to know. With the man standing right there and says, is it lawful on the Sabbath to do good or to do harm? To save life or to kill? Now, according to the Pharisees' own rules, you could help someone in need on the Sabbath if their life was in danger, and only if their life was in danger. And whilst a withered hand is debilitating, it's also not life-threatening. He could have come back tomorrow. Also notice how Jesus is on the offensive here. He isn't mean or rude, but he is the one confronting the Pharisees. Jesus knows what they're thinking. Jesus knows what they're trying to do, but Jesus is having none of it. He is actively, publicly, and with authority pointing out the Pharisees' brutally unkind system. So Jesus asks the Pharisees the question, and they were silent. They didn't have anything to say. And I think their silence here is really telling. The answer should be obvious. But they have no compassion for this man. Their legalism, their rule following, doesn't allow for that. They can't do anything for him. Or rather, they won't do anything for him. Because their own man-made rules say they can't. The text says that Jesus looked around at them with anger, grieved at their hardness of heart. This is the only time in Mark's gospel, and I'm almost certain in all the gospels, but it's definitely the only time in Mark's gospel, where it explicitly says that Jesus is angry. The only time. Let me be clear, Jesus is not angry like we are. He was sinless. All of our anger is tainted, or if we're honest, always sinful. But this is something different. This is godly, righteous, sinless anger. But also look at what else Jesus felt. He was angry and grieved at their hardness of heart. He was sorrowful at their hardness of heart. The word hardness here can also be translated as callousness. So the Pharisees are cold, calloused. And Jesus is angry at this and is grieved by this. But wonderfully, Jesus is Lord of the Sabbath. He decides what is right and wrong on the Sabbath. He knows that the Sabbath is a day for doing good. So he tells the man, stretch out your hand. And the man's hand is restored. As an aside, do you notice how much work Jesus put into that? He said 4 words. Stretch out your hand. And the man's hand is restored. Jesus is showing his authority over the Sabbath by healing on the Sabbath in front of the authorities who say that he can't. The message is clear. Pharisees, your rules are wrong. Your religiousness, your legalism is wrong. You've created a rule-following system that has a negative impact. It's taken a day that God gave to Israel as a gift and made it into a burden. Where you can't even have compassion on the poor and the ill, and that's wrong. And this hit the Pharisees where it hurts. Jesus' teachings here are so offensive that the Pharisees, as it says in verse 6, the Pharisees went out and immediately, still on the Sabbath, immediately held counsel with the Herodians against him, how to destroy him. The word destroy can also be translated as fully destroy. Immediately after this event, the Pharisees are looking for a way to murder Jesus. It's Jesus' teachings around the Sabbath that hit at the very heart of the legalistic, rule-following Jewish religious system that are the straw that breaks the camel's back for the Pharisees. I don't know if it always surprises me how early on the Pharisees are like, yeah, we've got to kill this guy. Now, you might be sat there thinking, this is all well and good. But what does this mean for us? Well, let me come back at you with a question of my own. How frequently do we do what the Pharisees are doing? We say we want to follow God's law, and we create arbitrary rules to do that, and then brandish those over other believers' heads. We create non-biblical rules that restrict us, shackle us, burden us. I can't wear that thing. I can't watch that show. I can't play that game. It's unchristian. Or we say to other people, they shouldn't be watching that thing. They shouldn't be engaging with that. I can't believe they have the audacity to wear a tracksuit on a Sunday morning. I'm confident that as I'm speaking, you're thinking yourself of more of these sort of arbitrary rules that we enforce on others, that if they don't submit to, they're not really a Christian. For example, not actually that long ago, you'd hear people saying, oh, you can't go to the cinema. It's not Christian. It's not right to go to the cinema. It's not right to have a TV in your house. That's unchristian. This legalism, this pulling rules on, can create an environment that is cold, callous, and judgmental in us and in the church, and we don't want to be like that. Now, don't mishear me. I'm not saying do what you want. I'm not saying that there are things I am not saying that there are not things that we should and shouldn't do. I'm also not saying that there's not wisdom in thinking about what TV shows we watch, thinking about what outfits we wear, thinking about what we're engaging in, etc., etc., etc. There's wisdom in that. Jesus' problem was not with the Sabbath itself. It was with the Pharisees adding to and twisting of the Sabbath, which created this rule-following system that left them in a place where they felt spiritually superior because they followed all the rules, but in the process, they were judgmental, cold, and hard-hearted. Cool, I think we're fine. Where they're spiritually superior, but they followed all the rules, but in the process they were judgmental, cold, and hard-hearted, and burdening everyone else, and therefore completely missing the point of the Sabbath in the first place. That's the fruit of legalism. It's the fruit of rule following. And if we're not careful, we can become that too. Some of us, actually, are already a bit like that. We really don't want to be like this. We don't want to be known as a place like that. Jesus called the Pharisees whitewashed tombs. They looked nice and pretty on the outside, but inside they were rotting corpses. Later on in Mark chapter 7, Jesus is talking with the Pharisees again about traditions and commandments, and this is what Jesus says to them. And he said to them, that's the Pharisees, well did Isaiah prophesy of you hypocrites, as it is written, this people honor me with their lips, but their hearts are far from me. In vain they do worship me, teaching as doctrines the commandments of men. You leave the commandments of God and hold to the tradition of men. Let's not be like that. I think it's right that we just take a little bit of time to pause and reflect about how we can be a bit like the Pharisees, how we can be taking God's law and twisting it, how we can be putting rules in place to disqualify or burden other Christians. So why don't we take a moment now to come before God and think about it. Then I'm going to pray, and then Richard will come and lead us in communion. Father in heaven, I'm sorry. We're sorry for the ways that we create rules that burden others. That we take your good rules and your good gifts and shackle ourselves and shackle others. We thank you that you have come to set us free. You did not put up with the Pharisees' approach then, and you don't put up with it now either. We thank you for communion, and I pray that you will help us to see you afresh as we gather around the table. Amen.